Let's talk about Marx for a bit. I feel like every time I mention Marx, the anxiety level in the room goes up a notch. So let's deal with that first. There's a mythology about Marx that's been built up over decades of anti-Soviet propaganda. Most of you have probably already heard this story, but just in case, uh, Russia, which was back then called the Soviet Union or the USSR, was America's main geopolitical enemy. This would have been true regardless of whether Russia embraced communism or kept the Tsar. We know this. We know this is true. They would have been enemies anyway, because Russia is still the US's main geopolitical enemy, and they stopped even claiming to be communist over 30 years ago. My point is that when people hear the word communism or Marx or Marxism, they usually think of the Soviet Union or modern day China, even though in reality, those countries were and are about as far from what Marx called communism as you can get. I told you this was because of propaganda, but it wasn't just anti-Soviet propaganda. It was also propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union. Russia and China said they were communist. They claimed to be communist and spent quite a lot of money crafting an image of themselves as a worker's paradise. I may have mentioned something called Marxist-Leninism earlier, or possibly Marxism-Leninism. It doesn't matter if I get the name right because it's not a real thing. It's not a coherent political philosophy. There are no texts explaining it. It's just a way to slap the word Marxism onto whatever policies and ideas the people in charge of the Soviet Union were pushing at the time. I guess they called it Marxist-Leninism so that they could deviate from Marx as much as they wanted, but still call it a form of Marxism, I guess. Anyway, whether you want to call it state capitalism or fascism with a worker-friendly coat of paint, it doesn't matter. We don't have to get into it. Just remember that it was absolutely unlike what Marx would have called communism. We're going to talk about Marx. Put out of your mind all associations with Soviet Union or so-called communist China. So if communism isn't what you've been told it is for your whole life, what is it then? Well, I'm supposed to be spending a big chunk of this lecture unpacking that, but just so that you have somewhere to like hang the word, the central concept of communism is that the workers control the means of production. If the workers don't control the means of production, it's not communism. What does that mean? Workers control the means of production? I know it's like a slogan you could stick on a bumper sticker, but here's a real life example. There's a form of business called a co-op. Okay. This is a real thing. There's lots of co-ops and lots of different companies. And what makes this a co-op, which is probably short for cooperative. Anyway, what makes it what it is, and I'm just going to call it a co-op, is that the workers own the business. The workers own the means of production. I'm trying to explain that concept. I don't know if Marx talked about worker-owned co-ops. Doesn't matter. I'm just trying to explain that one expression. So in a co-op, the workers are a bit like shareholders. Every employee of the business has a share, and everybody has an equal share, and nobody else like owns any part of the business. So it is owned entirely by the workers, and everybody has an equal share. Got it? This means that if the business makes a profit, this profit is spread equally among all of the employees. Isn't that nice? However, one of the cool things about a co-op is that the business doesn't have to make a profit because the employees also all draw a salary. This means that they may decide collectively, because all the decisions are made democratically by the employees. Communism, the connection between communism and democracy, eh, Marx would say that communism is like an extension of democracy, actually. He would say that communism is the full realization of democracy, but we don't have to get into that. Um, a co-op is definitely run democratically. So the workers who control the co-op may decide to forego making a profit and instead give every employee free childcare with the money that could otherwise have been a profit. This would be more efficient than if every worker had to get their own childcare, because the company as a whole can negotiate a better price for childcare than if each employee had to do it on their own. Same principle applies to unions, but I don't want to get into a big digression on unions. My point is, this is an example of communism in action. It actually has nothing to do with everybody having to wear the same clothes or the suppression of free speech or anything like that. Okay, sorry about the preamble, but I think it was necessary. Now let's talk about what Marky Marx actually said. People seem to think that Marx was some kind of revolutionary. In fact, he was a 19th century German philosopher. He spent his life uh, traveling, writing, teaching. He was a professor. He had my job. Marx was a very sensitive man who was deeply moved by the suffering he saw around him in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. He also apparently watched Star Trek, but we'll get to that later. My point is that most of Marx's writings are descriptive rather than prescriptive. Do you remember that distinction? We talked about it in the first term. It has to do with how some of our statements are about how things are, and some of them are about how things should be and how those operate differently. Marx is best known for two of his writings: the Communist Manifesto, which is a pamphlet that he co-authored with another dude named Friedrich Engels, and also Capital, a 3-volume series of books that you've probably heard of under the name of Das Kapital. Normally in English, we refer to the name of books by an English translation of their name, but we know this work by Marx mostly under its German name. Why? Well, it's because of that decades-long campaign of propaganda that I mentioned earlier. The idea is to use the German name to make it sound foreign, basically, alien, and therefore bad. That's not even how it's pronounced. Das Kapital. German pronunciation works the same as English pronunciation if English pronunciation made sense. In English, we get this thing about not pronouncing the E's at the end of words from French. In French, none of the last letters of words are pronounced, except sometimes at the beginning of the next word. Ridiculous. So in the book that I'm now going to call Capital, Marx was not arguing that we needed to overthrow capitalism through a communist revolution. Not at all. What he was doing was describing the world that he lived in terms of systems and forces rather than the choices of individuals. This was kind of new. It would only be a bit of an exaggeration to say that the science of sociology started with Marx. Not that Marx was the first philosopher to think systemically. In fact, his work was an adaptation of the work of an earlier German philosopher named Hegel. But don't worry about Hegel, we're talking about Marx. My point is that Marxism isn't an ideology, it's a mode of analysis. And by that I mean it's a way of thinking about the world. Specifically, it's a way of thinking about the world on a large scale, at a certain level of abstraction that allows us to understand it, specifically in terms of how it got the way it is and where it's going. Marx saw capitalism as the dominant system that dictated the way society worked in his day, also ours. In fact, if you read Marx, this is kind of cool, actually. If you read Marx, his writings sound a lot more like he's describing, his writings sound a lot more like he's describing today's society than the world that he lived in the first half of the 19th century. Remember how I said that liberalism is not a particular political position, but a set of assumptions and categories that seem self-evidently true to most of us living in the world today, at least in the part of the world that we call the West? Marxism, Marxism is like that. Many of his ideas, such as social class, working class, middle class, upper class, although we don't usually say upper class anymore. Um, Many of his ideas have become part of the unquestioned background of our thought. Do you think that the working class is a real thing? Congratulations, you're a Marxist. So Marx didn't argue, or at least he didn't argue this in Capital, that the proletariat should overthrow capitalism and create fully automated gay space luxury communism. Instead, he predicted it as something that would happen. Okay? Descriptive, not prescriptive. You don't have to actually read Marx to get his ideas. In very broad strokes, his ideas have become part of the framework in which we think, just like liberalism. That said, although they have certain things in common, liberalism and Marxism are broadly contradictory modes of thought. That is, they disagree on certain important things. Liberalism is all about individuals making free choices, like in the social contract. Marxism, on the other hand, is all about impersonal, abstract, group level things like systems and forces. Marx agreed with liberalism insofar as he thought that what society should do is maximize the liberty or freedom of individuals, very unlike the Soviet Union, you notice. Actually, here's a quote. And the purpose of this quote is to give you an idea of a future for humanity that Marx hoped could be brought into being through a combination of social change and technological advancement. I'll read it. For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, he's talking about capitalism here, okay? So the first couple sentences, capitalism, not the future. For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a cultural critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, so now he's describing the future that he hopes we will achieve someday. In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. So the point of that quote was to illustrate how Marx wanted humans to be freed from labor so that they could pursue their interests, so that they could have fun, and so that they could become their best selves.
This is the 24th century. Material needs no longer exist.
Then what's the challenge?
The challenge, Mr. Offenhouse, is to improve yourself, to enrich yourself. Enjoy it.
So you could say that Marxism and liberalism are aligned prescriptively, but not descriptively. They sort of have the same ends. They just analyze the world in different ways. Marx used a mode of analysis that he called dialectical materialism. This basically means that if you want to understand how society works, you need to look at people on the group level, and you group people in terms of their material interests. So he thought that the most important grouping, the most important way that you split up people in society to understand how society works was according to class. And by class, he means social class, rich people, poor people, etc. Not like this is your modes of reasoning class. And keep in mind that the way we think about the word class, although Marx wasn't the first person to use it in that way, the concept as we think of it today, very much informed by his thought. Anyway, Marx saw that the forces of capitalism tend to organize people into two groups, which he called the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or as cowards call it, the bourgeois. Like I said in a previous lecture, capitalism in history replaced feudalism. Feudalism was all about hierarchy. There were a bunch of classes arranged in a hierarchy dictated mainly by birth. There were kings, lords, knights, etc. But by Marx's time, capitalism had largely reordered society into just two classes whose identity is determined by their relationship to what Marx called the means of production. Here they are on the slide. These two groups were what he called the proletariat, or the working class, or sometimes just the workers. The proletariat or working class contains the vast majority of people, and it means people who make a living, who make their money by selling their labor or work for a salary, whether at a factory or a university, doesn't matter. In Marx's sense of the word, I'm a member of the working class because I work for a salary. The other group of people, very small minority, he called the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie, this is what defines what the bourgeoisie are. They don't work. They're not workers. They don't have to work because they make their money just by owning things. Capitalism organizes society in such a way that the interests of these two groups are fundamentally opposed. The bourgeoisie, who I'm going to henceforth refer to as the capitalists, because bourgeoisie is a French word and we don't like French in these parts, they make money through profit, which, if somehow you weren't already aware, profit is the difference between how much it costs to make a product and how much you can sell that product for. There are various costs, in making a product, obviously. But in modern industrial society, by far the largest of these costs is paying workers to produce the product. This means that capitalists, which remember, is people who own businesses or have share in businesses, the investor class, if you like, therefore, they are motivated to pay their workers as little as possible. Now, I want to illustrate this by, well, I actually wasted a lot of time trying to find a short YouTube video that explained this concept with nice pictures and colors, but I couldn't for some reason. I found a bunch that brought in a bunch of other concepts, which we didn't need, and therefore would have just been confusing. And I found some that had titles like, Your Boss is Stealing from You, which seemed kind of biased, so I didn't want to use those either. That means that I just have to explain it to you myself without the images. Sorry. I might have stolen some of this from a YouTube video, though. Let's say you, yes, you, work at a pizza parlor making pizzas. You get paid $5 for each pizza you make, and your boss, by which I mean your employer, the business owner, but I'm just going to say your boss because it's easier, sells it for $10. So he pays you $5 to make a pizza. He sells it for $10. Obviously, these are made up numbers for ease of explanation, like all numbers. Since the pizza that you made is worth $10 and you only get $5, that means your boss is stealing half the value of your labor, right? Simple. Well, not so simple. There are other costs to running the pizza parlor besides your salary. There's the ingredients, there's the electricity, there's the rent on the unit if it's being rented. If it's owned instead of rented, there are a bunch of other costs. So let's say, hypothetically, that those other costs come to $4 per pizza. This means that between your salary and the other costs, your boss is only making a paltry $1 per pizza. That's not good. He's got shareholders to feed. This means that your boss will be motivated to pay you less than $5 per pizza, $4 or $3, or maybe 5 cents if he can get away with it. Now, I want to clarify that this doesn't mean that all capitalists are evil people who want to exploit you. It's possible that your boss would like to pay you $5 per pizza, which we're going to say is a fair price. But he has a competitor down the street who is selling pizzas for $7 a piece because he's paying his workers only $2 per pizza, 2 pp. This means that your boss will go out of business if he tries to pay you $5, a decent salary. It's the system that motivates him to pay you as little as possible, maybe even forces him. I mean, if he goes out of business, you're out of a job. Okay, so that was less of an oversimplification and maybe a hyper mega oversimplification, but don't worry about that. It'll do for now. What I want you to take away from this is that the Marxist mode of analysis says that if you zoom out and consider not just individuals and individual choices, but groups of people, and not just individual choices, but the accumulation of choices over long stretches of time, you will find that groups or classes of people will make decisions that serve their material interests, which under capitalism almost always comes down to money, regardless of how the individual members of the group feel, and sometimes regardless of what they want. This is what sometimes gets referred to as systemic thinking. Anyway, it means that if you want to make things better for people, you have to make changes to the system, which is usually done through legislation. So, for example, in the case of you and the pizzas, the government could create a law that limits how little people can be paid. So they have to, law says they have to pay you like this much or more. They can't pay you less than that. Let's call it a bottom salary or a remuneration floor or something. Maybe you can think of a better name. If we do that, if the government does that, it means that both your boss and your competitor have to pay you a fair wage, and they can't undercut each other, so they can both stay in business while you get to earn a living wage. Everybody wins. Again, real life, more complicated than that example, but that's kind of the point of examples, which are used to illustrate points. Yeah, I feel like some of you probably know quite a bit more about economics than me and are already wincing at some of the things that I've said. Sorry about that, but a lot of other people have never thought about this stuff before. And so we have to start at the ground level. Marx argued that because of this adversarial structure, capitalist labor was inherently exploitative in a way that goes beyond our ordinary understanding of the word exploitation. So when we hear the word exploitation, maybe we think of bad working conditions or maybe something to do with the commodification of sex. Now, that's a start. We can use those examples to lead us to the wider problem of exploitation that Marx describes. So the core of it is that capitalist labor is exploitative because it's coerced. So there's a great YouTube video that I watched a couple of months ago that asks the question, is it possible to make ethical pornography? Yes. The video was about, can you make ethical porn? The video is long and super interesting. Maybe I will put the link in the PowerPoint, but right now I just want to cite one tiny bit of it.
And I get that like a lot of their idea is like this wave of, I think it was third wave feminism, people were like, oh, sex work and like sexuality is empowering. And they want to like fight like, oh no, sex work's not empowering, it's exploitative. But do you know what kind of labor is exploitative? All of it. How are sex workers exploited? How are workers exploited? So the main thing is, how can we make sure that these people are there of their own free will and they're not being forced or coerced by various circumstances? They don't have to do this to survive. They are not being coerced, financially or otherwise, into doing these acts, this labor that they don't want to do and wouldn't do if it weren't for that coercive environment. In the US, it's work or starve. You can't just, not work. You'll die. They will toss you on the street and you'll die. So, work or starve, bitches.
The conclusion that she draws in the video was that if we want to make ethical porn, we need to institute universal basic income or something like that. It's been a while. You should watch it. So capitalism is exploitative on top of all the other ways that it could be exploitative and is sometimes, like the working conditions in sweatshops or the way professional workers like me are kind of quietly pressured into working much longer hours than we're actually paid for. Now, I'm not saying that people wouldn't work if they didn't have to work to live. We know this is not true. There have been several pilot studies on universal basic income which have demonstrated that people will choose to work even if they don't have to. What they won't do is work 40 hours a week at exhausting or humiliating or otherwise unpleasant jobs. And when you think about it, 40 hours a week is a lot. Like, I did some math, and there's actually a bunch of stuff that I decided to cut out of the video for time. But the idea is, if you add it up, we spend roughly one half of our waking hours over the course of our lives working at a job. Well, I'm cheating a little bit because I'm including school, public school, or university and stuff. Very similar. Going to school. You remember school? It was like very much like having a job. That's a lot. Peasants under feudalism, their lives sucked in a lot of ways that our lives don't suck now, but they got a hell of a lot more days off. And before that, before agriculture, when we were hunter-gatherers, so roughly 90% of the time that human beings have existed, we were hunter-gatherers. Estimates say they only worked about 15 to 20 hours a week, and they weren't working very hard either. This system where people have to work 40 hours a week, and yes, I know many people work more. This is the optimistic version. So people working this much is not normal. Um, it's not inevitable. We created this system, and we didn't have to. And it hasn't been around for very long. This system, industrial capitalism, has only been around for about 200 years. It's not natural, it's not inevitable. And while plenty of people like me have good jobs, a system that forces over 90% of people to sacrifice half of their waking hours just to stay alive is not a good system. It's a combination of just of being forced to work to live with just how much of your life it takes up that makes it really upsetting when you think about it. Central point is that in addition to all of the other ways that wage labor is often exploitative, it's also always exploitative to the extent that it's coerced. Now, what's particularly insidious, but also very, very interesting, is the form of coercion employed by capitalism. It's a form of coercion that tends to hide the fact that it's coercive. If I point a gun at you and say, dig this ditch for me or I'll shoot you, the coercion is right out there in the open. There's no denying it. But if I offer you a job digging ditches for me, you might think I'm doing you a favor. Maybe you really needed that job. The situation is basically the same, dig ditches or die, but it looks very different. I mean, it would be weird if you said, you're coercing me. From my perspective, I'm not coercing you. I can't force you to take my ditch digging job. You're not my ditch bitch. However, you do have to take some job. So it's not me that's coercing you, it's the system. And this gets at another even more insidious way that capitalism coerces us. It coerces us by bribing us. It coerces us by offering us stuff that we wouldn't otherwise have. One of the sillier defenses of capitalism that you might hear, that you often hear, is when people say, "Oh, you don't like capitalism. Well, I notice you like that computer over there. You like listening to your heavy metal. and watching your porn, you wouldn't have any of that stuff if it weren't for capitalism. Yeah. This argument is silly because it suggests that if we were to give up capitalism, we would also have to give up all of our stuff. But we don't, though. We already have the stuff. If we could somehow end capitalism today, the stuff wouldn't go away. We would still have everything that capitalism gave us. However, if we imagine an alternate history in which capitalism never happened, and I guess society stayed the way it was before capitalism, but somehow we were all still here, which definitely wouldn't have happened, but it's a thought experiment. Bear with me. If I had, if we, that alternative, and I had to choose between the the way the world is now and the alternative where capitalism never happened but I was still around, I'd probably choose this one. Lots of people nowadays get to live normal, fulfilling lives thanks to technology that we wouldn't have if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution. Maybe you thought I was going to say capitalism there. Well, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution are kind of tied up together in ways that I don't think I really have to explain, and I'm definitely not going to. You can fill in the blanks. My point is that capitalism is a kind of trap. It's given us a society full of wonders that we don't want to give up and that we kind of become dependent on, even though we weren't dependent on them before capitalism, if hypothetically we were around then. So it gives us all this stuff, but it also forces us to feed half of our lives to the capitalist machine. Thanks to the way money functions, you can get everything you want as long as you have enough money. That's great. But on the other hand, the flip side is if you don't have any money, you're screwed. You die, in fact. Capitalist modes of production are so much more efficient than the ones that preceded them that they mostly squeezed the other ways out of existence. Thanks to mass production and the factory system, ordinary people like you and me can afford cups and jackets and cell phones and all the other things that were previously made by hand. But we also can't make them by hand anymore. That world is gone. People sometimes describe capitalism as hegemonic. This means that it takes over. It squeezes everything else out. The other options die off. It also fosters the illusion that we can do without other people, that we don't need other people. The truth is, in reality, we absolutely need other people to make all the stuff, but that's easy to forget when we mostly only relate to other people through the medium of exchange. I mean, money. Not only does the system foster the illusion that we don't need other people, it also kind of creates a system that's antagonistic. Like, it makes it as if other people are our enemies. I already talked about how workers and capitalists or business owners have opposing interests, but it doesn't end there. Workers also compete with other workers for jobs. Capitalists compete with other capitalists to sell stuff. As we were reminded by the pandemic a few years ago, with the supply chains breaking down and stuff, our society is more interdependent than it ever was. So many interlocking systems that if just one of them breaks down, it can grind to a halt. What this illustrates is that it's all based on cooperation, But the system of exchange, the money thing, makes the system look like it's adversarial. Actually, or maybe it makes the system actually adversarial. I might have to think about that. There's a bit in Marx's writings, where he points out that as oppressive and often inhuman feudal lords could be, there was at least the understanding, they at least had an understanding that they needed to protect the peasants that they were exploiting from bandits and raiders, give them access to the land and the time that they needed to do the work that the Lord wanted them to do. Why do I bring that up? Well, now um, it's not like that anymore. Now, because money kind of substitutes for everything, the well-being of their workers, capitalists can just treat that as somebody else's problem. All they have to do is pay you a wage, which is normally the lowest wage that they can get you to accept, and finding a place to live and paying your bills and getting the cat out of your face is your problem. Not only is it your problem, it's an opportunity for other capitalists to exploit you. Do you remember what Hobbes said about the state of nature? That it was a war of all against all? You might not remember, but that was what he said. Well, the war of all against all is definitely not the state of nature, but it is kind of an approximation of the world that capitalism builds. So you'd think that since the proletariat is the working people and the capitalists are the rich people who own everything, the proletariat or working class would be aligned with the political left, and the capitalist or bourgeoisie would be on the political right. You'd think that, wouldn't you? But in Canada and the US, people near the bottom of the wealth hierarchy, what we call the working class in ordinary language, tend to vote conservative. And the left is associated in many people's minds with the elites, the people who control everything. So what's going on, man? Well, it used to be that working people voted mainly for left-wing political parties and policies. Throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the left won victory after victory. Progressive taxation, union rights, an 8-hour workday, weekends, wage protections, workplace safety laws, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, universal health care, public schooling. Yes, public schooling. Nowadays, stuff like weekends and the existence of publicly funded schools are not considered to be political issues. Everyone just accepts them as normal. But there was a time when they didn't exist, and they had to be fought for. The people who today oppose things like trans rights and raising the minimum wage are the spiritual successors of those who opposed the existence of weekends and wanted kids in factories instead of schools. Thank God they lost those battles. But somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, the right started to get smart. They figured out how to capture the votes of the proletariat, and that progress slowly became eroded. Did you know that prior to 1970, the richest people paid marginal tax rates of 80 or even 90%? That doesn't mean that they paid 90% of their income in taxes, by the way. We have progressive taxation, which means they paid 90% on the share of their income above a certain level, over $1 million, let's say. And like 70% for the next bracket, but only 50% on their income below this. It's complicated. You'd understand what I mean if you've ever had to fill out a tax return, though. The important part is that public works, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, all that was paid for by taxing the wealthy. You know, the people who could afford it because they had all the money. But starting in the 1970s, marginal tax rates started to come down. More loopholes were created, and by now, billionaires pay less in taxes than school teachers. Those tax cuts for the very wealthy were paid for by cuts in services. This is why most places don't have good public transit. This is why there are 10-hour waits at hospital emergency rooms. Emergency rooms? And if you want to see a specialist, it takes like 6 months. This is why everything seems to be getting just a little bit worse all the time nowadays. Because the people who want to hoard all the wealth and resources for themselves, people who would rather let children die of preventable diseases than pay 1% more of their enormous wealth in taxes, have managed to usurp the political power that should belong to us. Now, I'm going to tell you how they did it. I've already mentioned the Cold War. This was a period that lasted from the 1940s to the 1980s when the world was dominated by two superpowers, the US and the USSR, the United States and Russia. The US had its allies, including Canada and Western Europe, and the USSR had its own allies like China and North Korea. And both sides found it convenient to represent their opposition in terms of ideologies rather than interests. The US, which means, remember, our side, declared it was the champion of freedom, meaning capitalism, and the Soviet or Russian side was the champion of communism, meaning not real communism, but an undemocratic state bureaucracy owning and controlling everything. We've already talked about this. Through propaganda, the US spread the myth that freedom and capitalism were one and the same, and the only alternative to our highly unequal and exploitative system was that in Russia, which was a totalitarian dictatorship. And Russia was a totalitarian dictatorship, which meant it wasn't communist, but that's not what we were told. As a result, politics became framed as a choice between freedom on the one hand and equality on the other. And any attempt to make society more equal here was associated with communism, with the bad guys who wanted to take away all your freedom. And the Soviet-aligned states also benefited from this framing because they could tell their people that the only way to avoid poverty and capitalist exploitation was to give up all their freedom to the government. The political right became associated with capitalism and freedom with free markets, and the political left became associated with communism and therefore Soviet-style totalitarianism. Well, everybody likes freedom and nobody likes totalitarianism, so the normalization of this picture was a big win for the right. Of course, in reality, freedom and equality aren't opposing choices. In fact, you can't have freedom without equality. Think about it. Freedom means being able to do what you want instead of other people telling you what to do, right? Well, if there's relationships of unequal power between people, then the people with more power can tell the people with less power what to do, and thereby constraining your freedom. Your boss gets to tell you what to do because he holds economic power over you. See what I mean? However, the lie became entrenched through decades of Cold War propaganda, so it still has a lot of power even today. Minimum wage, communism. Union rights, communism. All things that are good for the working class, but the ruling class managed to smear them. Meanwhile, right-wing freedom is the freedom of the rich to exploit everyone else without the interference of the democratic state. Actually, why don't I let this other guy explain it to you?
Now, how could the wealthy hold on to power in a system where everyone can vote? if they only constitute a small minority of the voting public. So they quickly figured out three main tricks in order to convince ordinary people that their own interests will be served by voting for the right-wing parties, the parties that enact the policies of the rich. Number one, the first trick that they figured out was really easy. They realized right away that they could just point to all the real and awful things that are done in the name of the left, especially by the fake left, by people who want to establish a new hierarchy and elite, but in the name of equality and democracy. So like in the 20th century, they would point to the communist dictatorships and how they oppressed their peasants, or how they stifled individual freedom. Or today they point to how cancel culture lunatics are threatening to fire you for wanting to hear debate about trans medicine or about COVID lockdowns. This stuff goes a long way to convince ordinary people to align with traditional elites and business elites. You might not trust us, and we're stinking filthy rich, but the other guys are way, way worse. Number two, the second trick they figured out, is to make sure to always divide things according to identity politics instead of by class, like nationalism or race. All the people in your identity group are all one happy family, and our enemy is the other identity groups. Don't attack all the rich Darth Vaders and Draculas who suck up all the wealth in our society. Unite behind your Draculas and your Darth Vaders, and also unite against the working people from other identity groups who are organized under their Draculas and their Darth Vaders. So in the 19th century, it was, don't get mad at the rich people throwing you off of your farms and out of your trades and into the slums. Just be mad at rich Jewish people and rich foreigners, and also be mad at the foreign workers that we bring in to lower your wages. And today it's, don't get mad at billionaires and corporations, just be mad at woke billionaires and woke corporations. Check out any Vivek Ramaswamy speech on woke corporations for a perfect, disgusting example of this. As if there's any difference between woke or anti-woke billionaires when it comes to them wanting to pay lower wages and have less worker protections so they can raise their profits. And make sure to be mad at the immigrants and not the elites who are the ones using the immigrants to lower your wages and to pit everyone against each other. And trick number three is that the right-wing parties pretend that they will be the ones that are going to be delivering the left-wing policies that people actually want. Let the right-wing rich people parties save you from all the problems that the rich people caused in the first place in pursuit of their own interests. The same rich people who moved your jobs to Mexico and China are capitalizing on your anger about this in order to win your votes by pretending they're going to bring back the 1950s era of good union jobs, while they focus your economic anxieties onto immigrants and woke CEOs. And studies show that anti-immigrant sentiment, and even racist sentiments, are very often just proxies for economic concerns. The other tribe is going to take away my jobs and benefits.
And if we return to this list that you see on the slide, I think we can understand how all of the things that didn't really fit together can now be seen as being on the side of hierarchies and power structures, whether those be political, economic, i.e. capitalist, or other sorts of more subtle power hierarchies, such as race and gender. When people on the right say they want small government, what they really mean is that they want lower taxes on the wealthy, so not spreading out power in the form of money from the people on the top to the people on the bottom. When they talk about deregulation, what they mean is they think that rich people should be able to do whatever they want. They shouldn't be beholden to a government which is democratic. If you're invested in the system that capitalism fosters, then it's going to be very important that there are people lower down the hierarchy than you. That doesn't actually make you any better off. It just makes you feel like you're better off. If you're a poor black man, hey, at least you get to look down on poor black women. Why do people on the right say that they're all about freedom, but don't want women to be free to terminate their pregnancies? Well, it's because the constant threat of unwanted pregnancy makes women easier to control. It keeps them in their place. better not risk getting pregnant, better stay at home until you're ready to have a baby, which means married, which means under the control of a husband. It's very important that women be controlled, you see, because controlling women means controlling the means of reproduction. That's a Marxist joke, and like most Marxist jokes, it's not actually very funny, but it points to really true factual fact. Humans need to be produced just like gas and nails and car batteries because capitalism requires people to do the labor. So I'm sorry, ladies, you might have dreams and aspirations, but I need your body to make workers for my factory. But all is not lost. There are still plenty of people who have not been brainwashed by capitalism into thinking that the world is a dog eat dog place and there's nothing to do but try to become the top dog. The past 200 years have demonstrated that society can be changed for the better and that more equality, a more horizontal society, makes the world better for everyone, including the people at the top. If the richest people were compelled to pay higher taxes and that money was used to improve our education and healthcare and other social systems, what would happen is that society on the whole would become more productive. And in the long run, those rich people would make more money than the money that they lost through paying the taxes. Unfortunately, the structure of capitalism, as I tried to explain, makes it hard for them to think like that. Okay, so that's a lot to think about, and I hope you found the topic as interesting as I do. We're going to end now, and next week I'm going to try to pick a topic that's a little less controversial. Maybe feminism?